Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first Kilowatt Talks, live stream event for Holy Cross Energy members. Many of you are familiar with Holy Cross's Brats and Kilowatts in-person events that we held throughout our region prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. With a beer in your hand and a brat on your plate, you had the opportunity to learn about the latest happenings here at Holy Cross, ask questions of myself, our board, and other leaders of your cooperative. We certainly look forward to restarting those events once it's safe to do so. But since we can't gather together in person quite yet, we thought we would try this virtual format to give you the same opportunity to interact with us as owners of this great electric cooperative. I'm Brian Hannigan, I'm President and CEO here at Holy Cross. And to kick us off at our very first event, I'd like to welcome Steve Boyning, who's Holy Cross Energy's Vice President of Power Supply and Programs. Now, Steve joined Holy Cross in July of 2018 after a long and distinguished career at Xcel Energy, most notably as their Director of Market Operations. At Holy Cross, he's overseeing our journey to 100% transition to clean energy for our members and is driving a number of new member programs in the areas of energy storage, electric transportation, and net zero energy buildings. So welcome to Kilowatt Talk, Steve.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that.
I got to ask you, what happened in Texas in February?
You know, it got cold.
It sure did.
Can we please take a look at the next slide, the graphic showing the footprint. Brian, I know you have a weatherman's background. Did you want to talk in particular about the cold front that went through?
Well, you see, Steve, my professional opinion, that blue on the page, that's really cold.
That is.
Even for Texas, that's really cold. In fact, there were some all-time records that were set. 5 inches of snowfall in Dallas, almost that much in Waco. Snow all the way down to the Gulf Coast, which literally never happens. Yeah. And for almost 10 days, it was below freezing in areas that usually don't get that cold in February. So a pretty extreme event.
Yeah, it sure was. And it's not the first time Texas has had cold weather, but in a minute here, we'll show a slide talking about the impacts of cold weather on Texas power plants. I thought before we get into that, though, I'd point out back in 1989 and in 2011, Texas did have cold weather events that took place that resulted also in uncontrolled, or I should say, blackout type conditions for electric customers. So this wasn't new. In fact, after 2011, there were a lot of follow-up recommendations in the post-event analysis. It seems like many of them maybe weren't followed. Leading into one of the main points that caused pain in Texas is the fact that their market is what's called an energy-only market design, and it relies on scarcity conditions for investors who build generation to earn enough money to pay back that investment. Other parts of the country, in contrast to Texas, rely on a separate cost recovery mechanism for building the generation, and then they operate their regional markets in a way just to recover the fuel costs associated with operating the generation. As a result of that, they're less likely to experience scarcity in other regions of the country than Texas saw. So to some extent, the high prices that resulted during the cold weather were anticipated during conditions like this. But let's talk about what led to the actual blackout.
Hang on, yeah, I was going to say, hang on a moment, let's walk back. So we had extremely cold weather. Obviously, people are running their heaters. There's a lot more demand on the system, both for electricity and for natural gas. Weren't they prepared to meet that extra demand?
Well, it's interesting because with respect to natural gas that's used to fuel electric generation, the peak months of use of natural gas for that purpose occur in the summer when people in Texas are cranking their air conditioning.
Okay.
And so there's very limited competition on the natural gas pipelines because people aren't also heating. Whereas when you had a cold snap like this, people were heating and there was a strong demand on generation. There was a conflict in rights of use on the natural gas pipelines as well. I will say all of this stuff will come out in more detail in the official postmortems. I'm giving you what I understand
Right.
of it based on press release and things like that.
So not enough gas to go around.
Not enough to go around.
Even if all the gas that was normally being produced would be produced, there was still some shortage.
Well, let's go to this next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the contributions to the shortage conditions that were going on. I noticed when the blackouts started, there were, I'd call it skeptics of renewable energy that were stepping into the media and saying, this is a problem of wind and solar not being available. And actually, when you look at it, from what I've seen on the preliminary information, almost half of all of the generation in Texas was unavailable during this event. And the outages of wind and solar that were occurring, for example, the wind turbines were iced up in some cases and not producing, but the level of production from the wind turbines and the solar panels during this event was actually above the emergency shortage levels that for wind and solar that the planners in Texas had anticipated. It was these plant outages in other areas that drove the majority of the scarcity conditions. And so, for example, if we can go back to that slide, please, there were shortages of coal plant facilities where their coal piles were tied up. There were frozen, what's called process gas. The wellhead gas that comes out of the ground has liquids in it. And when that process gas is not sufficiently warmed, it can freeze up and stop production at the natural gas wellheads. So that was one of the factors that contributed to gas shortages. There were also natural gas fueled power plants which weren't available due to the cold temperatures. In the outage recommendations that came from 2011, there were recommendations for both coal and natural gas plants to do what's called thermal tracing, find the spots using infrared cameras where they were leaking heat during cold events and insulate those spots, just like our members should do at their homes,
there you go.
by the way, and find those spots and address that with insulation in a way to prevent loss of heat during cold weather events. So that was another factor. And then just looking back on the slide one more time, if we could, please. There was also a nuclear plant which tripped offline due to cooling water problems. So wind and solar were unavailable during that outage, but again, at levels that were anticipated, that were better than anticipated in terms of outage.
So at the very time where the demand for electricity and for natural gas was at an all-time high, an unusual high, all of these resources weren't available to serve that load.
That's right.
So what happens to the
gas side? They're both markets that can incur scarcity pricing. And that's good up to a certain point because it signals there's extreme demand. But when you get to a point where an increase in price doesn't result in any additional increase in supply, then you've got a problem.
Okay.
And that's what we were seeing in both, as I understand it anyway, in both the natural gas and electric production sectors. The prices rose to a point where they weren't able to create any more supply conditions.
Just because it wasn't there.
It wasn't there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So then there's all this demand. There's not enough supply to go around. We know that electric grids do best when the supply and the demand is in balance. When it's out of balance and you can't fix it, what happens next?
So that's a beautiful question, Brian, because in the natural gas system, you have a period of hours to reestablish balance between supply and demand. The pipelines are pressurized and can draw down on some of that pressure. On the electric system, supply and demand has to be balanced on a second-to-second basis. I have friends that work in the electric grid operations area in Texas, and they were quick to point out that what occurred were not uncontrolled blackouts. They were deliberate outages to electric consumers done in a way to prevent a total collapse of the grid. So they were controlled load shed events. And those were taken in response to a mismatch between supply and demand on the electric system. Can I do an example for you?
Go for it.
So let's say you're pulling a little red wagon,
Okay.
and the wheels on your little red wagon are turning at 60 times a second. That happens to be the electric frequency on the grid.
Okay.
So if you walk by me pulling your little red wagon, I throw a bag of concrete, the wheels slow down.
Got
right?
it. Yep.
You're carrying a heavier load now. And conceptually, that's exactly the same thing that happens on the electric system. That's 60 cycles per second. As more demand is added and supply doesn't increase, starts to drop. And what the Texas grid operator observed was that the 60 hertz set point on the grid was degrading.
Okay.
And when it got to a level that they felt could result potentially in risks to uncontrolled outages, they directed controlled outages to electric points of interconnection in order to balance supply and demand again.
Yeah, because the other power plants that we're operating, they're only really supposed to be operating within a frequency range that's somewhat finite. And when the frequency on the grid starts to deviate from that, those plants will also shut off to protect themselves. Exactly. And you get this cascading effect that leads to this big system-wide blackout, right?
That we never want to see.
That we never want to see, exactly. So you talked a little bit about markets, Steve. How did the Texas energy markets react to all this? And, did they react as expected? Were there some shortcomings that were found? Kind of how's the market side supposed to play out on this?
So there were strong market responses during the event. This is all anecdotal from my standpoint, but I've heard that, for example, gas consumers in California stopped using gas so that it could be redirected into the areas with shortage. Because that's a response to the high price for gas that occurred.
Yeah.
If you look at the exposure that one of our wholesale electricity suppliers had during this event, the price of natural gas went up everywhere in response to the events that were taking place. And I believe the dollar amount that Xcel Energy spent on natural gas during those 4 days is somewhere in the range of $300 million. Approximately 4 months worth of their natural gas normal purchasing expense blew through
in 4 days.
4 days. Yeah.
Oh my! Yeah.
And now that's a factor for us as a utility, as a wholesale customer of them, because that money to pay for that gas has to come from somewhere.
Right.
So it's being allocated to their retail and wholesale electricity customers, including Holy Cross.
Yeah, let's come back to that in a moment. I first want to ask, though, with what happened this time, and then, as you said in your opening remarks, it happened 10 years ago and 10 years before that. That kind of sounds like there's some sort of a structural problem with the market, doesn't it?
Well, it gets into the opinion of should there be capacity markets that are part of the wholesale electricity market design. And like I mentioned earlier, where there's a strong sense that everything should be free market, when they did their wholesale market design, they chose not to address the capacity attribute, in other words, assuring sufficiency of supply.
Okay.
They chose not to address that in a way that assured sufficiency. They wanted in their design to allow scarcity pricing to be the signal for investment in new capacity.
Okay, so the prices rise when there's not enough energy. If the prices rise enough of the time, somebody says, hey, there's an opportunity to come in and make some money. I'm going to build a new plant. What does the other side of it look like? When you talk about buying capacity, what am I actually buying? I get what I'm buying when I buy energy. What am I buying when I buy capacity?
So a lot of people, when they get poetic about capacity, they refer to it as steel in the ground. Okay. Steel on the ground. There's some resource that you can point to that has a certain amount of ability to produce energy. And there's different ways of counting resources. So a coal plant or a nuclear plant that has a nameplate, I'll just pick a number, of 100 megawatts, its counting for resource adequacy or capacity purposes is pretty close to 100.
Right.
But in a wind farm, 100 megawatt maximum production capability of energy may only count for roughly 15 megawatts of capacity.
Okay.
And so
and why is that?
Because of the variability and the uncertainty around the production of energy from the resource.
Okay.
So it's a statistical way of making sure, as we transition to wind and solar in the future, we're going to do appropriate counting of those resources to make sure that we have enough supply. We'll recognize that it may not be blowing in gypsum today, But if it's not blowing in gypsum today, it's probably blowing over in the Front Range,
Okay.
where our 100
Which
megawatt
is why we look at putting a diversity of resources.
Yes,
Gotcha.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And
cool.
so this aspect of counting on capacity, how you give the capacity attribute is one way to make sure you have sufficiency of supply. And then that sufficiency provides the energy that's needed based on the customer demand. Can I give another little example, Brian?
I love the red. I love the red wagon, except I'm not sure I'm pulling it at 60 cycles a second.
Well, they're tiny wheels, so they're spinning really fast. But people a lot of times get confused between power and energy, and the words that we use for power and energy in the electric industry are watts or kilowatts or megawatts. That's power.
Okay, so this is a power talk, a kilowatts talk.
Yeah. And then there's energy, which is kilowatt hours. And while people a lot of times can't tell a watt from a watt hour, almost everybody can relate to their car. And in your car, you have a gas pedal. How far down you press that gas pedal is how much power you're using.
Okay.
In Europe, they rate cars instead of horsepower in watts.
Mm-hmm.
So I might have a 80 kilowatt car, for example. I don't know what the right number is. So how far down I press the gas pedal is how much power I'm using. That's the electric demand on the system at a given instant. But what you pay for in your electricity bill from Holy Cross, and when we talk about energy, is that amount of power over time. And in the car analogy, that's how much did you put in your gas tank. I mean, when I have that pedal on the floor, I'm draining that gas tank fast. Mm-hmm. So I'm at a high rate of power, but I'm paying for energy. How much gas did I put in the tank? And that's the kilowatt hour piece that our members pay for.
Got it. So Texas was short. It didn't have enough power to go around, didn't have enough energy to serve all of its needs. Why didn't it just get it from New Mexico or Louisiana or somebody, I mean, if I'm short a cup of sugar and I'm trying to make some cookies for my kids, I go next door and say, hey, can I borrow a cup of sugar? Why couldn't we do that here?
To the extent that they were able to, given the way that Texas is interconnected to the rest of the world, they did. They have what are called direct current ties. They're not part of the national grid. They're a Texas island, connected only by a few interconnections because they're independent. They like to do it that way. God bless them.
Right.
But to the extent they were able, they did import electricity over those direct current ties. What we see in the rest of the country, I talked earlier about capacity. The rest of the country primarily addresses capacity on a planned basis to make sure there's sufficient capacity installed. But the other thing the rest of the country has in the lower 48, I don't want to leave out Hawaii and Alaska, they're separate cases, but the rest of the lower 48 have an interconnected grid that allows interstate deliveries of energy to help back each utility system up from their neighbors.
And that would have helped here in the case of Texas. So given all that, Texas was kind of on its own, but as you mentioned earlier, there were impacts through the markets as far as away as California. What were the impacts here in Colorado? How did the whole Texas situation affect consumers, including Holy Cross members?
Yeah. So I did mention that Piesco, one of our wholesale suppliers, had a significant expenditure on natural gas. In a typical month for the energy that we purchase from Public Service Colorado, doing business as XL Energy, we expect an energy price around approximately $33 a megawatt hour as a wholesale rate, 3.3 cents a kilowatt hour. What we saw for that month with this emergency event was a 478% increase in our power supply costs as that share of their natural gas fuel was passed through to us. So for the energy that we did purchase from Xcel for the month of February, instead of that expected cost around 3.3 cents a kilowatt hour, we actually saw a wholesale electricity price of almost 16 cents a kilowatt hour.
Yikes.
And fortunately, we had alternative suppliers, and we were able to exercise purchase options from those alternative suppliers. We own a share of a coal plant which produced energy, which helped us avoid purchases. We also have a power supply contract with an energy firm in Denver called Goosebump Energy. And as a result of those two sources of supply, we saved in the neighborhood of $10 million, maybe even a little more, $11 million in power supply costs for our members by exercising these options to go elsewhere in the market with advanced contracts.
So by having those other options to rely on, we were able to avoid the pass-through of the high costs that would have come directly through Xcel Energy.
That's exactly right.
Okay. And then that obviously translates through to the bottom line in terms of the rates that Holy Cross Energy members pay on their bill. Can you say a bit about that?
Yes. This might be a good time to mention that as a result of some of Holy Cross's work in exercising its options for alternative supply, we're fairly unique as a co-op in the state of Colorado to have these options. And as we've been exercising those, we have saved our members a pretty significant amount of cost for power supply. As a result of that, when this extreme bill came through from Public Service Colorado, we were able to absorb the bill based on the savings that we had already realized previously from those power supply arrangements. So fortunately, unlike some of the other electric utilities in Colorado that are struggling with how they're going to allocate these extreme increased costs to their members over time, we were able to absorb that right away.
Right. So for our members that have natural gas coming from Black Hills, for those that have electricity supply coming from Xcel, you're going to see a little adder on the bill as a result of all this. But if you're a Holy Cross member and you're buying your electricity from us, you're not.
That's right.
That's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to the physical impacts on the grid. The situation in Texas, it was a perfect storm, literally. You had this unusual cold weather event. You had all these different resources that were not available because they couldn't get the fuel, or they were frozen, or they were operating at diminished capacity. Could what we saw in Texas in February happen here in Colorado?
To a certain extent. I'm trying to remember the year. I think it was around 2008. We actually did have in Colorado some deliberate load shedding that occurred in order to maintain a balance between generation and load. And that was, I think that day it was 20 degrees below zero, and the natural gas pipelines were having difficulty keeping up. But for the most part, because of some of these things we've discussed today, I think we're pretty well situated to avoid the level of impact that occurred in Texas. We have resource adequacy constructs in place that help us assure under almost all conditions that we have sufficient supply. We tend here to have the utilities that rely on natural gas to fuel their generating resources may have firm delivery rights on the natural gas pipelines. In Texas, many of the generators did not have firm delivery rights on the natural gas pipeline, and then during the cold event when there was that competition, they lost that ability. So
firm, non-firm. Firm is guaranteed all the time. Non-firm
can be curtailed.
Basically, it can be curtailed if it's not available.
And so with those factors and with our ability to rely on interstate grid support, I think we're pretty well situated. We do have options for our members that have a resilience interest. We could be, for example, be hit by local wildfires.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that because Colorado, we know how to deal with winter, but as we look at a warmer, drier climate potentially due to climate change in the future, wildfires, hot weather like what happened throughout the West in the summer, affecting California. Are we as well prepared for that as we might be for the typical winter around here?
I believe so, but there's always risks to the system. Any generator, no matter where it's located, can trip offline or become unavailable. Our Comanche 3 unit was unavailable for the entire year of 2020. That's a coal-fired power plant. Right. Many people think, well, if we have coal, it's always going to be available. And that's an example of for almost 12 months in 2020, that plant was fully unavailable.
Another story in and of its own self.
But Brian, I'd just say for members locally that are interested in resilience as an option, we have a program available from Holy Cross called Power Plus, where we will help our members install backup battery storage at their site, whether they have solar on their rooftop or not, but particularly helpful if they have solar on their roof, because that will give them an option when our grid goes down to remain in service at their residence.
Yeah.
And so that's a wave of the future as battery prices continue to come down, and we've seen dramatic drops over the past several years, which have enabled us to launch this program. I think this will be something kind of a wave of the future. I'd love to have the ability to not reset my microwave oven clock again. And for the members at Holy Cross that participate in our program, we think that's one of the benefits that we have.
Well, and you also mentioned earlier in this live event the value of investing in energy efficiency. A lot has been written about how some of the homes in Texas fared better during the cold snap because they were well insulated and they didn't cool off, so to speak, as fast as some of the homes that might not have been well insulated. And I would say the same thing works in a hot weather environment as well, that you don't heat up as quick if you're warm and insulated. So, we offer home energy audits, we offer rebates for energy efficiency and weatherization work through our partners here in the community. And that's another great way that you can build your own local energy resilience. So let's see, we're coming to the end of the set piece here. But we're hopeful that you can now go to the chat function here in our YouTube live event and put your questions in there. Just a reminder that everything that you put on the screen will be on display both tonight and through the recording that we'll make available afterwards. So we ask you to family friendly and PG-13, but also any question related to the Texas event, to some of the power supply issues that Steve raised, to our journey to 100 and some of the implications of moving to a more clean energy driven system. Anything that you want to ask us tonight, we're here to address. We've got plenty of time to do so. And if you don't put questions in the chat, I'm going to have to make something up. And your questions are certainly better than mine. Steve, I do want to come back to this question of the power market design in Texas. If you had to, kind of pull some lessons from that, if you were thinking about the design of a wholesale market or a regional market here in the West, which we've talked a lot about, we've heard the 3-letter acronym Regional Transmission Organization, or RTO. Let's say we're designing something for the West involving Colorado. What lessons from Texas and California and elsewhere can we learn?
Quite a few. One of the things we talk about regional markets as if they're already here, and they're only here in part of Colorado. There's a small footprint of the Southwest Power Pool, which expanded into some of the utilities' footprints in the state. And about a year from now, the rest of the state will enroll in a similar style market design. Both this existing Colorado market and the market that will roll out in about a year are relatively simple markets that just try and optimize among the generating resources that are available at the moment. So they address balance between supply and demand, and to some extent they address this interstate sharing of the grid. A full wholesale market design called a regional transmission organization, like you mentioned, solves some additional problems that these tiny markets, which are rolling out right now, don't solve. They address things like long-term access to the grid, shared reliability attributes for capacity investment, things that help make the grid even more efficient than the efficiency benefits that are gained from these current short-run markets that are rolling out. But the lessons from Texas that we take away from this, in my opinion, focus primarily around the issue of resource adequacy, and that, in my opinion, had there been sufficient resource adequacy protections and sufficient sharing of grid capability, a lot of those impacts may have been avoided. And the reason I can say that is because I mentioned the non-firm gas piece. The extent to which a gas generator is counted if it has non-firm fuel supply is a It's probably a material issue going forward.
So say a bit more about that. You count a gas turbine as having that capacity, even though that fuel may or may not be there.
That's what's currently taking place.
That kind of seems off a little bit.
Yeah, it's like I have a car and you can count on it to deliver a pizza, but I'm not counting whether I have gas in the tank or not. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me. So I've got a question from, I believe it's from Ready Kilowatt, our famous mascot in Co-op Nation, asks, does Colorado have a reserve capacity market? Thinking, does the ISO, another independent system operator, phrase for an market operator, does it pay suppliers for having available fuel on hand for shortfalls? So this gets to that fuel supply question that we were just joking about. Can we pay somebody to have gas in the car at all times?
Sure. Before I answer that question, let me just acknowledge that Ready Kilowatt is a registered trademark of XL Energy, and we're not trying to infringe on anybody's trademark.
As a former XL Energy guy, you would know that. But thank you, Steve, for keeping me out of trouble.
Currently, to answer the question, currently in Colorado, there are no resource adequacy or reserve capacity markets, at least in the sense of a single organized clearinghouse. These arrangements are managed on what's called a bilateral basis. If we have a resource adequacy need, we can go and purchase from a developer or a generator or another utility those attributes that we need to show that we have capacity capability. We're currently buying that function through XL Energy. The question about does the grid operator pay suppliers for having available fuel on hand in a shortfall? No, they don't. That's a business risk of the utility itself.
But could you imagine a world where future market design provides some extra reward to someone that is a generator that has a firm fuel supply versus a non-firm fuel supply?
So in most market designs, the way that reward is delivered is through the market clearing price. And even in markets outside of Texas, during scarcity conditions, you see an increase in price, which results in greater profitability for the generator from its production. So most of that is built in to the market design already.
If you want to make money selling pizzas, you keep gas in your car. Our next question comes from Olivia Siegel. She says, you mentioned that Holy Cross was unique in Colorado in its ability to purchase power from other suppliers in order to avoid temporary high costs. What made that possible, and why couldn't others do that? And I think, Steve, here we want to talk about the dreaded all requirements contracts.
Sure, right? Let's talk about that.
Okay.
So the majority of the co-ops in the state of Colorado are served by Tri-State Generation and Transmission Association, which is what's called a G&T, which sits over the top as the wholesale supplier of electricity to those distribution co-ops. So we are a distribution co-op at Holy Cross. We don't purchase from Tri-State. We purchase, as I mentioned, from XL Energy and others. The reason that Holy Cross has the flexibility under its power supply contracts to purchase from others is a legacy to kudos to the management at Holy Cross back in the 1990s when the Generation and Transmission Cooperative Association that supplied us wholesale power went through bankruptcy. And Holy Cross found itself in a position having to renegotiate its power supply agreements. It was one of the options that we negotiated at the time, and we're still living under that contract now,
right?
Benefiting.
And it's unique to us. It's not something that any other co-op in Colorado shares.
That's my understanding.
Gotcha. Well, turns out that's pretty valuable.
Yeah.
And by the way, G&T, Generation and Transmission Cooperative, not Gin and Tonic, which is what I'll have shortly after we're done here. Just kidding. Joel Lee asks, Colorado seems ideal for solar with a lot of sunshine. Is that true? If I'm looking to add solar, how do I choose the best system to work along with my current Holy Cross service? Steve manages not only our power supply, but our consumer program. So I think he's got an answer for this question.
Yeah, I do. I'm just making notes so I don't forget as I get all wound up in the answer. But on the Holy Cross website, we have a list of preferred installers, ones who have met our criteria for consistency, good customer relations, certain attributes in terms of how they conduct themselves professionally, things like that. Even if you choose from among preferred solar installers for your residence, we ask that you get multiple quotes. Seeing each member's installation that goes in on the Holy Cross system and the costs that they pay for that, because we give incentives for you to install solar at your house, and we'd love to see you do it, but I see the prices that our members pay, and there's a wide range. And I think in general, if there's one message I could get out to members about their choice on installing solar, is get multiple quotes, because you may find that there's a significant price benefit for shopping around. There's one other thing I wanted to add about solar. If everybody only installed solar, we'd have a lot of surplus production at solar noon, and we wouldn't have much production at nighttime. And for example, in the winter, our system has its highest demand of the year in hours when the sun isn't shining. And so there's this issue of the integration of renewable supply over time. And this is why, for example, Holy Cross is really excited about seeing battery storage roll out on our system, because to the extent we can take that oversupply of solar energy from hours when it's more than we need and shift it into the dark hours from dispatching the batteries, that would be a big help on the economics. Personally, I'd love to see us also develop other tools to manage what I call renewable oversupply, things like pump storage hydro, commercial level batteries. I'll point out that in our recent Amoresco and Colorado Mountain College large utility scale project that we just announced, it's 4.5 megawatts of solar panels, but it's a 5 megawatt, 15 megawatt hour battery.
Right.
So that's a big gas tank on that solar field. We can fill up that gas tank during the sunny noontime hours and not even use the solar panels at that moment. We use them to charge the battery, and at night we'll discharge the battery when our system loads are the highest.
And that project, which was done in partnership with Colorado Mountain College, with Amoresco, supported by Garfield Clean Energy, that's the first, as I understand it, in a series of projects that we're going to say more about in the upcoming days.
That's right.
So yes, solar is a huge part of our journey to 100. You've also mentioned wind earlier. What's coming to Holy Cross members on the wind side?
I'm sorry, Brian. I just saw a question pop up on the chat box that made me laugh so much.
Yeah, we're gonna get to that one. We talked solar. What about wind? Where does wind factor into our journey to 100?
Okay, wind is going to be a big part of our journey to 100. Thanks for bringing me back in line there. But we have signed a contract for a 100 megawatt share of a wind farm, which will be developed on the East Plains in Colorado. That project is still in development and still has development risks, but we're both hopeful in terms of the economics for it and the timely development of it, that could provide approximately 30% of our annual energy requirement from a nice renewable source. And one of the things that's interesting about wind, it actually produces more in the nighttime hours than it does in the day. As a weatherman, I'm sure you know this, but the sun hitting the ground heats up the jet stream and raises it higher so it stops spinning the turbine blades. But at night, the jet stream moves back down lower. The turbines actually produce more energy. It's a beautiful complement to solar. And we're really excited to see that wind farm.
I'm very impressed, Mr. Boyning. I think I might give your answer a B+ if I were your instructor. There's a few little details, but basically, right.
Yeah, I might have used jet stream wrong.
Wind and solar are very nice and very complementary. And again, when you're looking to create resource diversity so that you've always got some power to supply the system, it's great to draw not only from wind, from solar, but also from biomass, from hydro, from a really rich portfolio that we have in our area. So now, to the question that made Steve laugh. This comes from our former Holy Cross board member, Clem Cove. He asks, Steve, can you explain the new Muon Experiment that does not follow the standard model? Clem is a very big fan of the Aspen Institute for Physics. This is where that question comes from. I would not be surprised to think that he's winding us up a little bit. Hi, Clem. Thank you for your service. Glad you're tuning in with us this afternoon.
Yeah.
Steve?
Hi, Clem. You always make my day with questions like that. All I can say is that the experiment found results so many decimal points off away from zero that it amazes me they can even do measurements like that.
I believe I also see that current board member Adam Quinton goes one further and says that would be Muon G2 to be precise plan. I think the two of them should come on the next issue.
Yeah, I
of,
think
of
we got a
Talks.
topic.
I can
for the
talk
next.
physics. So, Steve, as we're kind of wrapping the discussion up here, I wonder if you might explain a little bit why not only the benefits in the Texas situation of our relationship with Goosebump Energy and our ownership share of Comanche 3, but how do you see those resources playing out going forward as we progress on our journey to 100? Maybe take them one at a time.
Okay.
I didn't mean to ask you a real question there. We can talk about physics if you want.
Well, no, we had our fun with that, though. That was good. One of the things that Holy Cross is working on right now is we call it our integrated resource plan, which is somewhat of a roadmap. We've got a lot of resources in the pipeline that we contracted with in 2019, some in 2020, some more will be announced here in the next months. As those resources get developed, we think we'll be at about 80, 82, 85% annual energy from renewable supply. But getting that last 15 to 20% is going to be challenging. The good news is, as we're preparing this integrated resource plan, which will guide us between now and 2030 when we have our goal to hit 100%, A, we think we can do it. B, the obstacles that we have to confront are surmountable. Is that the right word? And there's some tasks we have to do, whether we do these independently or whether we do them in partnership with other wholesale suppliers. And there will be details in the resource plan that we expect will lay out some of our strategies, the extent to which we work and engage with our other wholesale suppliers to accomplish these goals as a team. Mm-hmm. And I just say the details of that are still to come. It's probably a little early to share how those might all play out. But I'm really excited to see that we've got a pretty good roadmap set to take us to 100%, and that I'm confident we can get there.
And we have plans after that integrated resource public comment. So those of you that are interested in the nuts and bolts and the details of our journey to 100, you'll have a chance to dig through that and offer your comment on it as well. Steve, a big element of our current portfolio is Comanche 3. How do you see that resource evolving over the next decade or so? I know there's been a resource plan filed by XL Energy, which is the majority owner of that plant. What does that mean for Holy Cross, and what should members be expecting?
Good point. Piesco, as the majority owner, gets to call the shots with what happens in that unit. At the end of March, Piesco filed with the Colorado Public Utilities Commission its plan for how that unit would be operated over the remainder of its life. As recently as a year ago, it was my understanding they were projecting that coal plant would burn coal until the year 2070 something.
Right.
What they filed in their resource plan at the end of March is an intention to retire that unit in 2040, quite a bit earlier. And starting in 2030, they announced their preferred alternative among all of their resource planning scenarios would be one where starting in 2030, they operate that plant a lot less. The traditional operating mode for coal is base load, they call it. You try and run it 24/7, pedal to the floor all the time. And under Piesco's preferred scenario for Comanche 3, starting in 2030, they'd expect it to be online only about 45% of the time. And Piesco's intention for the amount of energy, the number of tanks of gas they have to pay for, would be to only take about a third, a 33% capacity factor from the unit. What that means for us is we will have hours starting in 2030 where that unit may not be running as a supply option for us or for who we might be selling it to in the wholesale marketplace. We believe from the filings that have been made that the capacity attribute would still be there and be a source of value to Holy Cross members as it is today, even though we're selling the energy from the unit to a third party, to Goosebump Energy.
Say more about that. We're selling the energy from Comanche to a third party. Are we doing that now?
We are.
Okay. How does that feed into our ability to both own a share of Comanche III and provide 100% renewables to our members?
That's a good question. So we will do separate accounting. I hate to say we have two sets of books, but we have a set of accounting for the power supply that goes to our retail customers. To the extent that we still are an owner of Comanche III, we will redirect that supply in the wholesale marketplace to another utility or wholesale buyer.
Okay.
And that will count against us in the sense of the aggregate emissions of Holy Cross for retail plus wholesale supply. Our retail supply in 2030 will be 100% renewable, we believe. That's our goal, and I think we can make it. Our aggregate CO2 emissions of wholesale plus retail, we're projecting will have an 80% reduction from the levels of CO2 emissions that we had in 2005. But to the extent that we still have ownership of that unit and sell it in the wholesale marketplace, we'll have a CO2 responsibility associated with it.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. I've got a question now from Ziska Childs, who asks, is there a commensurate home install wind option to complement solar?
I have seen consumer level wind turbine devices. I will say they don't operate at the type of efficiency that the modern bulk system wind resources do. And let me give you an example. I had a conversation this past week with a wind resource developer who was claiming that the newest generation of bulk system wind turbine models that are being deployed are operating at near 50% capacity factor. So half the hours of the year, that generator is running. Right. That's amazing. That's what Piesco wants their coal plant to do in 2030.
Yeah.
And in contrast, when you have something that's a backyard wind turbine that's not built 110 meters up into the air, it's not catching the wind stream as efficiently, and the capacity factor, the amount of energy production that you get from those resources, it's not significant.
Yeah.
So you can do it, but it's not significant.
Right. Because the wind near the ground, near all the structures and the trees, and particularly in our mountainous region, there's a lot of turbulence that it makes for a very inefficient and irregular wind speed. Now, we do see these kinds of distributed wind energy resources in places like the Eastern Plains of Colorado, in Kansas and Nebraska, where it's a lot flatter, the wind cranks up. A lot of farms and irrigation facilities use these, really great. Not so hot in our area, unfortunately.
I've seen in Portland some of the skyscrapers have mounted some smaller wind turbines on their roofs, for example.
As an architectural feature, probably more than an energy one. So this next question comes from our current board chair, Dave Monk. He says, you've mentioned local projects like the new CMC announcement and front range projects like the wind project we were talking about earlier. As you look ahead to 2030, what do you foresee as the anticipated mix of kind of bulk system projects and things that are done more community or even locally?
Yeah. I don't have the precise numbers crunched based on the pipeline of projects that we had, but I've always just felt that based on the balance between the economies of scale that you get from the large bulk system type resources and the costs, the higher relative costs of the distributed resources, costs in terms of units of production, that the mix probably is going to be about 80-20, 80% of the energy coming from bulk system, 20% roughly from distributed and behind the meter systems. That's just my guess. I don't know. Dave, I think in the next year or two we'll see some of that pan out, and part of it will come from the decreasing costs over time of these distributed resources. Maybe that distributed portion will actually increase above my expectations.
And our board of directors obviously have a lot to say about those kinds of projects, as they're the ones that authorize the signature, right? So I want to talk for a little bit about resilience, this concept that we not only want the lights to stay on in blue sky days, what we call reliability, but we want the lights to also stay on during the black sky days, like we had with Lake Christine or the Grizzly Creek fire. Where does resilience factor into whether and how we select different power supply resources, or maybe in the future energy storage resources? How should we view that as an element of our future resource plan, our journey to 100?
That's a great question. I think we're at the developmental stages of being able to answer that. For example, Holy Cross is working on a research project right now up at the Aspen Airport Business Center, where we're looking at creating a type of community microgrid that includes battery storage. We can maybe take some of the solar output from our Pitkin 5 megawatt solar project, which begins construction here shortly.
Yay.
Store it in that battery. If the grid goes down, that local resource can be used to supply critical loads in the area. You know, you led the Holy Cross convening of critical load members in the Roaring Fork and Eagle valleys. And I think that was an important first step in that conversation, identify the critical loads that have exceptional resilience needs, not just about resetting their microwave ovens, but community safety, public health, things like that. And then what I hope Holy Cross can do over the next couple of years is develop a menu or a template. In partnership with our communities, we can ask, what are the attributes for resilience that you want to achieve in a partnership with the utility? We can bring to the table investments in capacity, for example, in demand response, in energy efficiency incentives and support that help make that type of development economical for the critical load customers to achieve their resilience objectives, and for the utility and the other utility members to get a benefit that's shared from that as well.
Right.
And if I can just go on that for a second longer, that resilience initiative undertaken by the members to address their concerns for black sky days when the disaster happens can have value for the utility in all the other blue sky days, and forms the basis for us being willing to partner with them on projects.
And it helps us share the cost as well.
That's right.
And if something like Texas were to happen here again, and we were, God forbid, having to rotate blackouts and reduce, do load shedding, as we call it, we could target those loads that were maybe less critical and limit the impact to folks staying warm, keeping their cell phone charged. The cell phone towers would stay up, the water and sewer would keep going, which we saw in Texas was not automatically assured. In fact, there were some really big impacts as a result of not having the resilience that I think they would have rather.
That's correct. I've only heard this anecdotally, but some of the electric loads that were shed to protect the electric grid reduced gas pipeline compressor capability, which made the gas delivery problems worse.
Hi.
And so that's an example of planning controlled load shed capabilities. Can I mention a detail on that, since I'm the geek with the microphone at the moment?
You sure can.
Holy Cross currently, as part of its obligations to the broader utility reliability rules, has provisions for automatic load shedding on its system. It typically is triggered only during extreme low frequency events, when that 60 hertz gets degraded.
When there's lots of concrete on the wagon, to go back to your
and so the scenario you mentioned in the future of being able to more precisely target those things at this point is aspirational.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think in the coming years that would be a great area of development, is to be able to do more targeted load shed to less critical loads.
I've got a couple more questions here, so let's try and hit these. The follow-up question from our board chair, Dave Monk: what kind of opportunities should our members be looking for in terms of local sites for future RFPs, requests for proposals? Mm-hmm. We did one in 2019. I think we did one also in 2017. We're coming up on 2021. Is there another one of these in the future, and what should we be looking for?
So part of that will depend on the final version of the integrated resource plan that we talked about earlier. I think the soonest that our next round of general all-source type solicitations would come out would be either late this year or sometime in early 2022.
Okay.
And that's just a matter of timing and logistics. At the member level, our members have options both for net metering under our current tariff structures today, and we also have a tariff on file. It was approved by our board of directors last fall where we have a standard offer for small generation resources that are renewable up to a 0.5 megawatt in size. If a member wants to build something like that, we will make payments to them and to any other enrollees that they bring along as investors in the project, as long as they are Holy Cross members.
So true community solar.
Community
Literally
solar.
go and grab your neighbors and say, we're going to build a big solar farm on this plot of land that I've got,
that's
and
right.
we'll negotiate a good deal.
And since we're talking about it, I want to give fair warning. The price for that is not the full retail price. When people net meter, they offset our full retail price, and in doing that, because of our rate structure, that shifts cost to other members. The price that we pay for distributed resources under our tariff is the price that we pay for energy, and it's a neutral benefit. It's a neutral financial impact
Right.
to all of our members. There's no cost shift.
But you do get all of the benefit of running your meter back if you're using that solar on site for your consumption rather than pulling it from the grid.
As a net meter.
As a net meter.
That's right.
Yeah. Good. So we've got a couple other questions, and then I think we're coming to the end of this hour from HCE 14 regarding Senate Bill 72 and connecting Colorado to a regional transmission organization, or RTO. During February's freezing weather, Colorado did well, but RTOs to our east had problems and had rolling blackouts. How would joining an RTO affect prices charged to Holy Cross members?
Yeah, RTO, the cost of an RTO comes in a couple forms. The cost of an RTO includes the administrative fee. They have to have a building and employees to execute their functions. You see in utilities across, or in RTOs across the U.S., a range of administrative overhead costs from 25 cents a megawatt hour to $1 a megawatt hour. So there is that fee that's paid for the administrative overheads. You also start seeing an allocation of the cost of the regional grid as new regional grid facilities are built, and that can have an impact on prices. I'll point out, for example, that for Holy Cross, Public Service Colorado has already announced approximately a $2 billion transmission upgrade whose costs will pass through to us. So that these exposures exist whether you're in an RTO or not.
Right.
Those costs or overheads associated with an RTO tend to be offset by the increased efficiency in the way in which the generating assets are operated. So you see a reduction in the net price for energy as a result of that. There can be contingent events that impact utilities in an RTO footprint as well, as the questioner points out. And in my experience, the likelihood of overcoming shortage conditions through the cooperative structure that exists in a regional transmission organization is much better than when every utility is in a fend for themselves mode in a non-RTO footprint.
Yeah, it's the cooperative way. Ideally, the costs associated with being part of the RTO are outweighed by the benefits that you get in the lower market costs and the greater efficiencies, right?
Yeah.
Great. One last question for you, Steve. As we have transited so far since, first 70, 70, 30, now our journey to 100, what has been the impact of all of this clean energy and all of these changes in our power supply mix on price? What's been the impact? There's kind of a view that if you bring on these new technologies, it's going to cost a little bit more. Is that actually what we're seeing here?
We've been saving money.
Sorry, say that again?
We've been saving money.
Okay, good. I want to make sure everybody out there in YouTube land heard that.
Yeah, the interesting thing is the incremental cost of new wind and solar is below the average cost of the embedded system. So your old stuff costs more than your new stuff.
Okay.
And the transition to new stuff for people who can make it is advisable for that reason. As long as you keep your eye on the reliability issues, which we do.
Yep.
Then it's a benefit to be able to make that transition.
Do you see that holding up as we go the rest of the way to 100%?
I do until at least the 85% range. We will know more about that last 15 to 20% as a result of the next round in our resource solicitations. Like I said, that would be issued maybe later this year or next year.
Great. All right, I think that's a great place to stop. Obviously, lots more questions. We could go on for a while longer, and maybe we'll come back to the topic of all things solar at a future one of these Kilowatt Talks. Steve, I want to thank you for being here this afternoon with us, sharing your insights with the Holy Cross members and all those that are watching and will be watching as we share the recording broad and wide. And I want to thank all of you for attending this very first Kilowatt Talks live stream event. We'd love to hear what you thought of this afternoon's event. So visit our Facebook page, visit our YouTube page, or our website at holycross.com and post a comment or a review there tonight, tomorrow. Give us your feedback. We'd love to hear what you think. Our next Kilowatt Talks event will focus on wildfires ahead of what appears to be a very dry and hot summer season, unfortunately, in the valleys here that Holy Cross serves. We'll talk about how Holy Cross is hardening its system against the impacts of wildfire and steps that we're taking to keep the lights on and to reduce the risk of wildfires in our area. So watch your email, watch our website for information on the date and the time of this next future Kilowatt Talks event, as well as the others that we'll plan in the series throughout the rest of the summer. And make sure to invite your friends and your neighbors to join us too. If they missed this, they can find it on our YouTube page, play it back at their leisure, and catch up on the recording, and then make plans to attend the next one where they too can ask questions about particle physics. I'm just kidding. Until then, on behalf of all of us here at Holy Cross Energy, I wish you all a safe and healthy April and the rest of the summer, and I look forward to not only seeing you on a future virtual event, but I look forward to seeing you in person again very soon. Thanks very much for being with us tonight, and thank you for being a Holy Cross Energy member. Good night.